everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm David Bernard, and this is episode number 3. That's right, my third podcast ever, and so far it's going well, and I think all the response has been great at the same time. I appreciate that. A reminder, in addition to this audio podcast, we also have a video version that's available on our website at fox8live.com, or you can search on YouTube for the David Bernard podcast. And of course, if you're already listening to the podcast, well, you know where to find it, your favorite podcast app, and we are on just about all of them. This is being recorded on March 2nd. It was just Severe Weather Awareness Week at the end of February for Southeast Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, and that means the spring severe weather season is here. This is the most likely time of year that we are to get severe weather, meaning damaging thunderstorm winds, large hail, and tornadoes. Flooding, of course, can happen just about all year long, and it's been pretty quiet the last several years. I know I'm knocking on wood here, but you may recall 2016 and 2017. Boy, we had those enormous tornado outbreaks, and of course we had the devastating spring floods as well. To talk more about the spring severe weather threat, my guest today is Ben Schott. He is the meteorologist in charge at the National Weather Service in Slidell. They are responsible for forecasts and warnings as far west as Baton Rouge, and as far east as Pascagoula, and as far north as Macomb, Mississippi, and then back down south to Grand Isle. Ben was previously in charge of the National Weather Service in Milwaukee and Binghamton, New York. He also served 6 years in the Navy. Thanks for your service, Ben, as a weather and oceanographic observer and forecaster. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, let's first start out by saying what we're going to talk about today, and it's severe weather season in southeast Louisiana. But I'd be remiss if I didn't at least recollect a little bit about what happened this past year. Basically, 7 cones and 5 Louisiana landfalls. That must have been just a marathon for you guys at the Weather Service.
It was exhausting. And is 2020 over? I haven't noticed. But yeah, it was an incredible season. It felt like it was never going to end. It's hard to even go back and remember that we had Cristobal at the very beginning of the season, because it started to become every 3 weeks there was a new storm and with a new name, and then the names got weird as we got into the Greek alphabet. So the whole office was exhausted. I was exhausted. I think the whole state of Louisiana was exhausted. And let's just hope that as we move into hurricane season here in 21, we don't have to see anything like that for quite some time.
Well, we're going to find out what happens. But in the meantime, it is spring severe weather season, and we do get significant severe weather here on the Gulf Coast. It doesn't happen every year. In fact, it's been a little bit of a desert, knock on wood, the last few years. But boy, we had, I'm thinking back to 2016 and 2017, actually the first 2 full years I'd moved back to New Orleans. Just a slew of major storms and floods, from the Convent tornado to the New Orleans East tornado to the floods in Baton Rouge and on the North Shore, the river floods. So we can get some pretty rough weather.
Yeah, it's kind of like one of the forgotten threats that we have here. You know, everyone so focuses on tropical season and then flooding, which is something that's always an issue in this part of Louisiana. But the severe weather threat is there and exists, and every now and then it catches us, just like you mentioned with the New Orleans East tornado a few years ago. And it's something that everyone needs to go ahead and have in the back of their mind, especially as we move through the next couple of months.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk, you just had Severe Weather Awareness Week that the National Weather Service sponsors every year, helping to bring awareness to the various threats that we can face, primarily in the spring and the fall. And I wanted to know, so we all know about hurricane season, right, which begins June 1st, theoretically. But what about tornado season? Do we have a tornado season here in southeast Louisiana and Mississippi?
We do, and there's kind of two. There's kind of one that's a little bit more pronounced, which is the spring. You tend to have all the ingredients that you need for thunderstorms. You have the big energy coming out of the southern plains that really helps produce things and pull in the moisture from the Gulf here. So we have our spring season, which we're kind of in the midst of, or the beginning of right now. That'll run through April and May, and then start to wrap up as we get into the more summertime pop-up thunderstorm scenario that we see as we go through this, the months of June and July and in the tropical season there. And then there's another, peak as we get into the fall. It's kind of the reverse, right? The jet stream and everything's working its way back down south. We're still getting the moisture. The systems come out of the southern plains or the Four Corners region of the United States, and they allow all the ingredients to be there again. So those are the two main seasons. I think the spring season tends to be the more dominant one. And so as we move in through the month here of March and into April, and maybe even early May, it's definitely severe weather season here.
All right, let's talk just a little bit more about tornadoes. I hear a lot of people often say, gosh, David, it seems like, the big tornadoes always go north of us. Why are large, strong tornadoes, and usually we have the enhanced Fujita scale, right? EF0 to EF5, which we can talk about in just a minute. And generally, an EF2 is considered a strong tornado, which is somewhat unusual here. Which very unusual is an EF3. Why are they so rare here and more common, say, just to our north?
Well, tornadoes are pretty particular to develop. You have to have just almost a near perfect set of circumstances in the atmosphere to get a tornado, and then to get a tornado to be able to sustain itself and to be that strong is really hard to reach. And so that's one of the biggest factors here, and it is the marine layer. So we're so close to the Gulf of Mexico. You have the lake, and so you're able to push in what's a little bit more stable air. And what that stable air does is just keep that circulation from working its way all the way down to the ground, or being able to strengthen in a way that you see is when you get a little bit further inland. Here in the office, we talk a lot about that we ship the actual strong storms, to Mississippi, which what typically happens. You see it all the time in the Florida parishes. These really strong supercells develop, and as they get a little bit further away from the marine air, and maybe a little bit closer into the state of Mississippi, you really see them spin up. The second part of that is a lot of times the heart of the system that helps create the spin and the energy for these systems are just a little bit further to the north. And so because of that, as it gets a little bit closer to that preferred area, which a lot of times, again, is in southern and central Mississippi, you see that increase in the strength and the rotation of those storms as it moves into those areas. So that's what kind of keeps us out a lot of the times, not all the time, because we have those situations like, again, with the New Orleans East tornado, but it keeps us out of the worst possibilities because we kind of are sitting where we're at right now, close to the Gulf.
And that's what I was going to talk about, being close to the Gulf. And the further north you go with the less water, you can get more destabilization of the atmosphere, right? Because of the difference with the land. And but let's talk about New Orleans East. There must have been a special atmospheric environment that day to produce that significant of a tornado. You mentioned the upper air energy that we show our viewers a lot, the atmospheric spin. I always pay very close attention to that. And when it's in Texas and it's taking off to the northeast into Arkansas, not always, but a lot of the times, it's like you said, that worst weather can be just north of us. Was there something special going on that created that extra strong tornado a few years ago?
Yeah, I mean, you have your ingredients you need. You have to have three ingredients every time. You have to have moisture, you have to have something to lift the atmosphere, and you have to have some kind of instability. And when you put those three things together, you're going to get thunderstorms. But the one part that a lot of people don't think about is wind shear. And that's kind of like what you mentioned earlier about showing some of the things going on a little bit higher in the atmosphere. Most people experience all the weather obviously at the ground. They don't think about what's happening thousands or tens of thousands of feet above them. But when it comes to tornadoes, that's probably one of the most important factors, is you have a change in direction and a change in speed as you go from the ground up higher up. So if the bulk of that, the strongest portion of that is a little bit further south and not over portions of central or southern Mississippi, and it's a little bit further down over our area, which was what was happening on that day in February, then you can get that. You can get that right combination to get the really strong spin in that storm, and then also have just enough to be able to keep it and maintain it on the ground and at the intensity that we saw on that day.
And I know that you've seen the New Orleans East tornado, at least, studied it and aware of what's happened. And I remember that day so vividly. We were so lucky in some ways by the track of that storm. It devastated the neighborhoods along Chef Highway, south of Interstate 10 in the east. The tornado literally reached the ground as it crossed the Industrial Canal. We're talking about an EF3 storm here, very powerful winds. This could have easily dropped in over Metairie or Mid-City, and we would have been looking at one of the worst urban tornado disasters probably in some time.
Yeah, and that's the part that we have to kind of keep in the back of our head, because we all have these kind of tornado myths, right? They don't hit big cities, or there's always some kind of landmark. I've worked in 8 offices in all different parts of the country. It's amazing how every part of the country has a certain landmark that just keeps the tornadoes away. None of that's true. The only thing that we have that kind of helps us a little bit is the Gulf and the stabilization of that marine air when it does come fully in. So for us, it is possible for an event like that to still happen in our area. And I've talked to the forecasters who have been in our office for 10, 15 years, and they have tons of stories like that. Of storms that lifted right at the last second before maybe it went into parts of St. Tammany Parish that were very highly populated near Mandeville, Madisonville, Covington. So there's multiple stories of this where there were really strong storms with tornadoes on the ground, and they lifted or they went down at a certain spot. And so we have to realize that this stuff can still happen to us, and that's the reason why we need to prepare. And then with that one being an EF3, you're talking winds, in excess of 136 miles per hour, up to maybe as high as 160, a low 160 or so range. And so the amount of damage that will do to any structure, even well-built structures, would be immense. And we saw that damage that day.
All right, let's talk about some safety techniques here when it comes to tornadoes. Obviously, by and large, we do not have basements in southeast Louisiana or in a lot of Mississippi. Some folks do, but it's very rare. Let's start with the house. What should people be doing when tornado warnings are issued?
Rule number 1, even though this is the hardest thing to do, even for meteorologists, is don't go outside to look for the tornado. You put yourself at risk in a way that I don't think realize, especially if your lead time may only be 30 seconds, a minute, which is possible sometimes. These things can come up and develop really quickly. So 2, stay in the house and stay away from windows. So if you have large windows, again, the natural instinct is to want to be able to see the threat, to see the thing that is possibly threatening your home and your family. And I get that. But you're going to want to find a safe place in your home. And now, where is that safe place? Typically, that's going to be in a closet or a bathroom in an interior part of your house. And so if you can find something that puts a couple of walls between you and the exterior, that's the place you want to be. And if that's a bathroom, it's even better, because typically, whether it be in a single family home or whether it be in an apartment building, you want to try to be in the lowest floor. But if you can't there as well, if you can be in a place like a bathroom in an interior, there tends to be plumbing and other things that will help add just a little bit more structural integrity to that area. So that's the place to be. You just don't want to be in an exterior room, and you don't want to be exposed to windows in a situation like that.
And same would be true in office buildings and school. The goal is really to get away from exposure, open windows that can cause flying debris. That would be lethal. Yes. All right, I'm going to ask you a question here, and you're going to tell me what's wrong with it, okay?
Okay.
It's not a tornado warning. It's just a thunderstorm warning for wind.
That one right there makes my heart sink, because as part of my job, I've done so many damage surveys. Tornado damage surveys where we didn't have a tornado warning out. And I like to say that the Weather Service is perfect, that we get it all right every single time. I like to say that every time we issue a severe thunderstorm warning, it's just going to be a little bit of hail or a bit of wind, maybe you lose a shingle. But that's not the case. Unfortunately, tornadoes form in these events. And even if they don't form and do damage, I think a lot of people don't understand the force of 70 and 80 mile per hour winds. That's the same, again, as a lower end hurricane. So you're going to have roof damage, structural damage, could blow in windows, debris, like we just mentioned, could be flying in through your house. So these are still dangerous situations. And we have tried in the Weather Service to start to let people know if we think we're just warning for hail. Hail typically isn't deadly, but if you've seen some of those large stones in Kansas and Texas, that you obviously would not want that to hit you. But we're trying to differentiate a little bit better there with our messaging. But if we're under a tornado watch, and I would say just about any time we issue severe thunderstorm warning, it's still a life-threatening situation. It can be, but especially if we're under a tornado watch and we issue what you think is just a severe thunderstorm warning, you should go ahead and treat that as a tornado warning, because it's possible there could be a spin up in there. The atmosphere is already primed for it. It's just not worth the risk. I understand why a lot of people would act that way or think that way, but it's not worth the risk. And you wait it out 10, 15 minutes, most likely the storm's by you, and then you can go back to, whatever you're doing and just kind of keeping an eye on what's to come.
And that's a good point you brought up. And when Lauren was a guest on our podcast, the warning coordination meteorologist at your office in Slidell, we talked about warning for severe thunderstorms and whether or not maybe there's too many of those going out, maybe because they're being warned for hail. And of course, with the advent of phones and alerting that way, the good side of that is people are getting the message instantaneously. Maybe the bad side of that is they see it over and over and over again and kind of become, anesthetized to it. Like you mentioned earlier, these squall lines, these derecho events that we've seen the last few years can have these winds even up to 100 miles per hour are possible. And of course, a lot of these squall lines, they take up a lot more territory than an individual tornado cell. So they really have the potential to impact even more people in a significant way.
Yeah, and I think the other good kind of thing to mention here kind of goes along with this is, the chances of you actually getting hit by a tornado are insanely small. But these severe thunderstorms happen quite a bit, and they do a decent amount of damage. And we see people get hurt in them all the time, whether it be from the actual winds or the flooding. But I think hopefully here soon we'll be able to start to fully differentiate again, like I mentioned, between just a hail event. Again, we warn for both property and the protection of life. So, we're trying to tell people that your property could be damaged. That may not be life-threatening, but that's part of our job. That's our mission. It's actually the core mission of for the reason why the National Weather Service exists, protection of life and property. So I get it why some people, like you mentioned, would get kind of, you get just, completely wanted to ignore, because maybe we're just doing more of the property things with hail or more minor other damage, maybe tree damage, things like that. But in the end, you have to know the environment you're in. And if we're in a tornado watch, I think everybody really needs to treat severe thunderstorm warnings, especially in that environment, just no different than a tornado warning itself.
Let's shift to flooding, of course, and that can be a threat any month of the year here. I mean, I remember one of the worst floods we had was in January of, I think it was 98 or 99. It was a big El Nino year. Maybe it was 98. And had something like 22 inches of rain or something that month. So it can happen any time of the year. Warning for flooding, that's become a little bit more, I don't want to say complicated, but I guess multi-layered, kind of along what you're discussing with how we might try to break out severe thunderstorm warnings. So if you issue a flood advisory versus a flash flood warning, and I get that on my phone, and we'll talk about the WIA as well, what should I be thinking? What's the difference between these two?
Well, advisories tend to be more nuisance flooding. So it could be, if you have a ditch on your street, overflowing into your street. It could be, some low spots in your town or in the city, right? Where there's water ponded up now. It typically isn't life-threatening, but it's something that if you make the wrong decision, it could be. Obviously children shouldn't be playing in those situations. You shouldn't still drive your car into that low spot underneath the bridge. So those are more of advisory setups. Warnings tend to be where you start to have water coming into businesses, into homes. If anybody drives into that water, it's going to float their vehicle, no matter how big they think it is. I was in the Navy. I was on an aircraft carrier. It seems pretty heavy, so it's hard to believe that people think that their heavy truck's not going to float when they drive into the water. So it doesn't really matter. And those situations are where we know anybody who interacts to try to drive in or gets in that water, there could be a lot of heavy flow with it. That's the other part people don't really respect, the force of water. You're
Sure.
talking nine pounds for every square foot. So if you have thousands and thousands of square feet of water moving through even what was a small creek bed, its force is enough to take down a child or a full-grown adult. So that's the difference between the two. Advisory is more of a nuisance stuff that if you just avoid it, you'll be okay probably. And warning is if you don't move to a higher ground or you don't move out of the way where the water is flowing, you're really putting yourself at risk.
All right, so let's talk about the different kinds of flooding that we have here in southeast Louisiana. We have the urban flood threat, of course, primarily for the immediate South Shore that's most vulnerable, Jefferson, Orleans, St. Bernard, St. Charles parishes. And then, of course, north of the lake where we have our rivers, we have our river flood threat. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the 2016 river floods, which were just devastating and incredible events north of the lake and then also in Baton Rouge. So how are those two types of threats approached? Is it a different approach?
Well, I mean, every scenario is a little different. And the beautiful thing that we have in our office that most of the other folks in the National Registers don't have is we have the river forecasting, the hydrologist folks right next door. I can walk over, our forecasters can walk over, and we can talk about the scenario and get a better grasp of how we think the river streams are going to perform. Now, going back to what's going to happen, let's say in the city, where we know a heavy thunderstorm dropping, 5, 6 inches of rain in 2 hours, there's going to be all sorts of water issues there as well. So they're two different things. And we're trying to work a little bit differently, I think, when it comes with the city, especially for that type of more urban flooding. The city has been a little bit proactive, added some sensors in places, some signage. We have access to that data, so we can see when certain parts of the city are receiving very heavy rainfall, and that creates flooding issues there, which helps us be a little bit more proactive with issuing warnings for the city itself. And so there are different ways to kind of tackle this flooding beast. And so we're trying to find ways to be a little bit quicker to let people have a little bit more heads up. And we've seen that a couple of times, I think, in the last year or two, where we knew that there was about ready to be flooding across parts of the city, and we issue a flash flooding warning a little preemptively to hopefully try to get people to be able to get, maybe cars or things on common ground
Yeah,
or
I've seen
neutral
that.
ground. And so we're trying to be a little bit more active there, instead of having a mindset of, well, that's just what happens. And because, there's just been too many times recently, even just in my 2+ years being here, that we've had multiple events like that within the city. So there are two different ways to tackle the same thing, but it's something that we continue to work on to try to find ways to be a little bit quicker, maybe to give people more time to react and take the precautions and actions they need to.
You know what I think is amazing? I think the computer models are really these high resolution models. And really, the 2016 flood was the first time that I perked up and said, wow, these may be onto something. And that was the same year, of course, of Harvey. And I remember these high resolution models several days out started putting out these totals of 20, 25, 30 inches of rain, which I, kind of was like, this is getting a little bit on the extreme end. Could this really be the case? They really turned out to be quite well. And then you fast forward to Harvey a few months later, they start spitting out 40, 50, 60 inches of rain, which was shockingly and unfortunately accurate. How has that helped you with your forecast?
The advancement in modeling has been amazing. Since my beginnings in meteorology when I was in the Navy back in the 90s till now, I can't even fathom how far we've leapt forward. You throw in with the advancements in satellite sensors, and you combine those two together, and it's really created setups where we really do have an idea that we're going to see extreme events, which is something before you'd see it in the models and you would have a lot of skepticism, like, oh, that
Yeah.
seems unfathomable. Like you mentioned with Harvey, the idea at the time that we could tell people 3, 4 days out that they were going to see 5 feet of rain is is just mind blowing. But it happened, and people kind of had. I think they still had a hard time absorbing it because that just seems ridiculous to get a year's worth of rain in a couple of days.
Yeah.
But the modeling, yeah, has improved drastically and allows us both in the short term and maybe a couple of days out, because like you mentioned, these high resolution models sometimes will give us a really good look to say, hey, in the next 3 to 6 hours, this event's going to go from a modest rain event to a possible flooding event in this area, and we might need to start messaging that right now.
All right, I'm going to talk about another subject near and dear to me, and that's lightning. It comes up on, this is my third podcast, by the way. So this is only
Right,
my third time for doing this, right? But lightning came
right.
up in podcast one and podcast two. It's coming up again because I have a little bit of a fear of it, but I know it's a rational fear. It's not crippling or anything, but I don't waste time and I get indoors if there's any hint that something might go wrong. I think it's ironic that lightning is really the most dangerous aspect of almost any storm, and that causes the most number of deaths. Yet we're not able to warn for it. Do you see any practical way of communicating this threat without over alerting the public? Because obviously, lightning is prevalent nearly every day, especially here during the summer months.
I I I don't, unfortunately, but I wish we could. That's the interesting thing. I've been a warning coordination meteorologist and a forecaster for so long in so many different places, and I've actually ran lightning awareness campaigns in the city of Louisville, Kentucky, and other places. And it was always something that I felt that, I couldn't believe that a lot of people would get caught off guard and be struck by lightning. And if you look at a lot of lightning deaths, that's usually what happens. It's people still doing the stuff that they were normally doing. They're continuing to golf. They're continuing to mow their lawn. Or they think, well, it's raining, so I'm just going to run under that tree. But
Yeah.
if you look at the amount of lightning strikes every time we have even just pop-up thunderstorms, you could have lightning strikes in 15, 20 parishes at one single time, and you can't light up all of those parishes and say, hey, everybody run inside. It's I think this is more of a public education thing that us and everybody needs to kind of join in with, to let people understand that we have a silly little saying, when thunder roars, go indoors. But it would be great if, I think, if people appreciated the threat, like you mentioned. It is an immense threat,
Now,
and it happens too many times.
right. I mean, the one tool that we have right now is like on weather apps, and the Fox 8 weather app does have a lightning detector on it, but people have to make sure that they turn on for alerting lightning.
Right.
And it also has an audio version, which unfortunately is a rather annoying voice of myself saying lightning has been detected in your area. I need to re-record that because, but it does get people's attention. I have people come up to me, hey, David, lightning's been detected in your area. So that may be the best we can do is, with GPS locating people, taking their phone with them, and letting them know if there's significant lightning around.
Yeah, I would love to sit there and say that we could force feed everybody on this stuff, but there's also a little bit of personal responsibility part of this, and that's something that's weird maybe coming from the National Weather Service, right? Because our whole job is the push messaging, protection of life and property, and but it's something unfortunately everywhere I've been, there's just been so many needless deaths from folks maybe not appreciating the threat, because if you can hear thunder, you are way too close. And I always used to kind of joke with my family and with friends that that was one of my biggest fears, was that if I actually stayed out around a storm, or if there was, that I would get struck, and then it would be, National Weather Service meteorologist struck by lightning. And I was just like,
we all have that fear,
yeah,
Ben.
yeah, yeah.
It's not just you. That has crossed my mind as well. Final topic I want to discuss with you, and is kind of an interesting one, and it's forensic meteorology. And I call it the CSI of meteorology. And the National Weather Service, oftentimes you may have to bring in other people if it's a huge event down the road. And of course, insurance companies have their own way of dealing with damage. But talk about your National Weather Service survey teams when we have, say, a tornado or wind damage, and which you go out and which you look for.
Yeah, so we have an extensive training program within the office. Most offices do. We want to make sure that we're doing this the right way and we're doing the science correctly. The interesting thing, and we mentioned earlier about the EF scale, the Enhanced Vegeta scale, and that came out of a lot of studies working with engineers and meteorologists, kind of working together to see how structurally sound things were built and how they would be affected by certain wind speeds. So it restructured the whole way that we look at the damage survey science. And so we kind of went through, and there's all sorts of damage indicators. And what I mean by that is, whether it be a single family home or whether it be a power pole or those large transformers or a large mall or school, we have certain thresholds that we know that, typically within this 20, 30 mile per hour range, we know this is what the damage would look like to that type of structure. And so we're able to look at all these things, and we go in and look at every individual thing. And if we need to, we'll actually get someone with some engineering background to help us look to make sure that it's a well-constructed building or structure, whatever it is, to make sure that we're getting the right range. And we do the same thing with trees. They worked with all sorts of botanists to make sure they had the idea of how different hardwoods, softwoods, and all that. So there is quite a bit of science and work that went in behind this to make sure that we're rating it the right way. And the interesting thing is a lot of times when you see the pictures can still be deceiving if you're not seeing the whole picture.
Sure.
Because you have to realize you could have a house completely blown off its slab, but if it wasn't connected to the slab, that doesn't mean anything. I see that a lot of times. You'll be amazed. And that was the one interesting thing. I was lucky enough, real quickly, I'll tell a quick story, to actually meet Tim Marshall, who is kind of one of the figureheads in this arena.
Yep.
And he came and he gave a talk, and I was taking down notes. And I remember when he was talking about this part in single family homes, how I went home just completely freaked out about my house because it was built in a way that he said would be really susceptible to be slabbed and just pushed right off its foundation real easy. It wasn't bolted down. So regardless, there's been a lot of science behind it, and we go out and we'll spend maybe 2-3 days, and we'll actually try to go along the whole track. So if it's on the ground for 30 miles, we may actually be on the ground for a good chunk of that, walking, foot by foot as much as we can, and we'll go by the air too if we need to.
Yeah, because tornadoes, especially along a damage path, there may be just a small area, but it shows that it's an EF3 intensity. Then the tornado may lift, be weaker. So it's important to, I guess, look at the entire picture when you're doing that. Okay, Ben, yes. I've got a final question for you. Okay.
All right.
Do you have an I know I was another weather nerd win, or I wanted to be a meteorologist win story?
Yeah, I call them, it's kind of like a superhero origin story. There's usually one for every meteorologist. So I grew up on a farm in Indiana, surrounded by cornfields, bean fields. And, growing up there, we had a huge blizzard in '78. And I remember not being able to go to school for a while. So much wind and the drifting, it had to be a couple feet of snow. That was what hooked me. But then later that summer, we had a tornado go through the cornfield, and I could see the stalks being thrown up in the air. And then that was it. I was hooked. And I was like, this is what I'm going to do. Everybody in my school, from middle school, high school, Ben's going to be on TV, do the weather. I end up going this route on the weather service. I worked some time in the Navy as a forecaster because I wanted to make sure I could get to school and become a forecaster. So I was just hooked as a kid, and it took that 1-2 punch of a huge blizzard. And I'll date myself. It was 1978 for those historic weather people that want to go back and look at that.
I was
blizzard.
Around. Don't feel bad.
But yeah, it was that. And then even as a kid, then growing up, I saw multiple other storms. That's the nice thing about Indiana being flat, not as many trees as you would think in parts where I grew up. And you could see the tornadoes off in the distance a couple of times as a kid. So I was always hooked at that point. And
that's a great story, Ben. Let's keep the tornadoes off in the distance. Let's keep them in the cornfields or, away from us. And here's to a quiet severe weather season. And hopefully we won't have to be speaking to you that much. But thanks again, Ben Schott, meteorologist in charge at the National Weather Service in Slidell. Thanks for being with us.
Appreciate it, David. Thanks for having me.
And that'll do it for episode 3 of the podcast. A reminder, as we get deeper into the severe weather season here, you'll want to have your Fox 8 weather app handy. It's a unique weather app because it just doesn't give you the forecast. It has actual explanations from the entire team here at Fox 8, which I think sets it apart from the rest of the weather apps. Thanks for making it the #1 weather app in Southeast Louisiana and also in South Mississippi. And of course, the podcast, you can get the video version at fox8live.com or on YouTube. And a reminder, we're on all of your favorite podcast apps if you want to download and listen to the audio version. Stay safe, everyone, and I'll see you next time.